I hope that you've enjoyed your time during week 4 studying the poetry of the moderns, and I know that we're heading into week 5, and then of course into our midterm. Now, week 5 is of course building on our sense of modernism from the poetry, but we are going to also be introducing some short fiction. And then of course, we will be turning into our midterm. Now, just to let you know, the midterm is available for you to go ahead and take now. However, the midterm, incorrectly, the dates got put in for it to end on the 14th, and it actually is going to end on the 21st. Now, you only take it once, so you'll want to make sure that you set up your ProctorU and that you go in to take the midterm through ProctorU, but the dates will be, instead of the 14th, they will be to the 21st. Now, I will also let you know that there was an issue with the dates for ProctorU, so they are showing to the 14th, but I've sent in a correction and a quick fix, and I'm hoping to speak with someone on Monday and let you guys know further what you should be doing in relation to your midterm. Now, I can say that many of you do enjoy reading poetry, but I know that many of you experience some of a disjointed or sense of disjointedness in regards to T.S. Eliot's work. And Eliot is very complex. I know that many of you enjoyed reading Ezra Pound's In the Station of the Metro because it is very short and it's very engaged. But it is, there are many things that we're going to talk about in relation to modernism today in the screen capture. Now, modernism, in many ways, we always think of something that is modern, which generally means that it's bad, and I'm not sure why that is. But there is this connotation that modern is not of permanence, that is of recent times. You know, that there's a sense that that it's a group of characteristics, and it can imply a strong and conscious break with tradition, a sense of historical discontinuity, which is good. And I think we can see that historical discontinuity, that kind of sense of jumbling, occurring in particular in Eliot's work. Shannon, starting with yours, I enjoyed that you kind of really focused on, you know, interpreting the poems, Marianne Moore's, Ezra Pound's, and of course The Wasteland. I think you did a good job of engaging it, and I do think that Kayla's response to you is a good start. I think Priscilla's observations are very prescient. I like that you are focusing on this idea of fragmentation. That is a key component of The Wasteland. You know, it is also a key component of the moderns. I mean, if any of you Googled modern period, or if you've watched, you know, Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris, you get a sense that the modern period was filled with Hemingway and Eliot and Pound and Gertrude Stein, and they were all running around, and time was not of the essence or even understood. But there's more to that. There's more to the modern period than that. We're also talking about a sense of fragmentation in social worlds, in civic worlds, and in public worlds, in relation to, of course, World War I and World War II being the bookends, and then, of course, you know, all the various, you know, the atom bomb, things along those lines with Freud and his minds. And there is a lot going on there. So I want us to think about fragmentation, of course, and alienation being one of the tropes, or the major characteristics of this poetry, and also of the fiction. Now, Priscilla, in her posting that followed Shannon's, engaged in a similar format. Ezra Pound's, kind of this notion of putting a lot of faith in the reader, and there was a lot of faith put in the reader. You know, that this everything is short. This kind of this sense of innocence being disturbed or disjointed is definitely apparent. And I like that Kristen comes back and really engages this in a dialogue. You know, this idea of love story and not just a booty call is hilarious. I love that. But it does have, there's such richness to Pound's poetry, in that he wants you to see something on the surface, but there's so much underneath it. And I really appreciate Kristen's and Priscilla's observations on this poem. remember that during the modern period, there's a flowering of talent, but also there's a sense of reacting to the Edwardian and Victorian era of that kind of almost stilted and very dry way of engaging in relationships and in being, kind of part of society. And there is an attitude of kind of a laissez-faire, or being more kind of the vernacular that you are hearing in this. Um, I do think that Kayla's observations could use a little bit of, bolstering from using some of the words, but I think that you've done a good job of engaging this kind of paraphrase or summary of your work. I like that you are also focusing on the idea of intimating on death. You know, death is something that is at the forefront of a lot of the moderns, because the ontologically uncertain time period is one that doesn't hold a lot of faith for what's going to happen to you when you die. There's a lot of questioning about, faith and religion, and also questioning of the mind and the body's connection. So I really like that you guys in this discussion in particular kind of debated that, and thought about, this notion of return, the painful return, etc. James, I think in your posting that you brought in, kind of a different perspective. Like I said, I would really appreciate it if you just cut and pasted your observations in. It's just an extra step for everyone, and it's just easier to do it that way. I appreciate your observations, but I do think that instead of attaching it in a Word document, I would prefer that you just cut and paste it in. Now, in relation to what you were talking about in regards to modernism, and think about modernism as occurring between 1914 and 1965. So you've got a pretty good period of time. Now, I think that you are doing a good job of engaging kind of what's going on in the story, but kind of maybe connecting it outside with what's going on in the world. For instance, if we think specifically in a station in the metro, now this work really can reflect back to the sense of a poetic voice and of imagism. Imagism is what Pound is kind of known for, this sense of making things, disrupting the subjectivity and playing with it in a way that disjoints the reader from the poetry, but at the same time makes it so powerful. And poetry is hard to observe. It is very hard in many ways to kind of just engage like a story, because it doesn't have a plot, and it does rely a lot on what you're going to be bringing to the text. So I always tell people, usually with a poem, it takes 2 to 4 reads. And what I like to do is I read it once, write out what I think it is about, and I rank my understanding on a scale of 1 to 10. And then I'll read it again and write out what I think it was about that time, any new insights, and then I rank my understanding. And then I read it a third time, write out what I think it is about, and then rank my understanding. And normally at that point, if I'm still wrestling with the poem, I go out. I go out and grab something off the internet. I go off and grab something from the library. I go off and grab something from one of my dictionaries. And I think about what it really means. So poetry, while it may be fewer words and maybe it implies less involvement, it involves so much more involvement. And I think that in Clyde's observation about rereading and reading the poem and this kind of sense of empathy is so important, because it is a poet. It does want to involve you in a relationship. A poet is very different than a traditional short story or novel writer. He or she, the poet, wants you to be engaged in a protracted involvement with their words. So it does take a bit of time. I do agree that it was very hard to understand. It wasn't originally written in Latin. I don't know where that came from. Eliot's The Wasteland, it was basically it was written in many different languages. It is kind of a profound text that captures the space of, I guess you'd say, 1922-ish. It does borrow a lot from myth and legend, so it does kind of give it a special place in history. And it does have a sense, like you mentioned down here, of Bibles, of Hindu religion, of kind of what the thunder said, that ending. Um, and it looks like your peers, like Ryan and Shannon, both appreciated your observations in relations to your story, to your poetry interpretation. So I like that you introduced enough observations that you pulled in your readers and you pulled in your respondents. Now, I will, as we go to Dina's, you can take a look here. Dina's, well, I think, and I don't want to pick on the posting, but this posting is a little too surface. Remember, when you write your postings, you want to make sure that you have a main idea, which is what this has, but then some evidence and some analysis. And right now, Dina, this is a little too sparse. I think, you really want to allow whoever's going to be responding to this to understand that, hey, I think that this is an interesting poem because it talks about the different situations as phenomenal while breaking down poetry's raw materials. It is said that one must think to understand this thing we call pottery. So maybe some editing. But where do you see that in the poem? What lines draw this to you? For instance, Marianne Moore suggests, or asserts, or presents. And this needs to have a little bit more of a push towards evidence and analysis. Now, I agree that the poetry is hard, and I know that sometimes it's difficult to write about it, but I would highly recommend, take a look at good paragraphs. Main idea, evidence, analysis. I absolutely love, this is Shannon's second posting, this kind of use of the evidence, the pulling into analysis, this idea of time. This is specifically key. And also, I love that you mentioned reading the footnotes because people have often remarked that this poem would be nothing without the footnotes. And I enjoy that you mention this because it is a whole experience. And it's okay to try to read the poem literally, but we know that it's all kind of up for interpretation. Now, Curtis's observation of Ezra Pound is appropriate. And that you talk about the sense of what's happening in the poem. You also give us a good bit of analysis here with this poem demonstrates when someone prolongs their affections. I would have liked to see a little bit more of how this connects to the modern time period, but I think you've got a good start here with your interpretation. Now, as you guys are finding out, Pound and Eliot are very different as a writer than Marianne Moore. And as we continue forward, you will see that the other poets that we're going to be reading, that they too will be slightly different, and that poetry doesn't follow the same stock formula. Jennifer, I think, did a fantastic job of what does it say, what does it mean, what is its value. I so appreciate that you use that. I think that is a great structure for kind of putting forward your information because you have your kind of main idea, you have your evidence, and you have your analysis. So I have to say, Jennifer, this is a fantastic posting, and I really appreciate the way that you structured it and the way that you shared your information with others, because now someone else who comes along and reads your posting, can get a good sense of what's going on. Katie, thank you so much for involving the poetry in your quote, however, and in your response. But I do think that this is a little too sparse. Remember, and I would almost say go back to Jennifer's and take a look at that. What does it say? What does it mean? What is its value? Because that is a great structure. And I think right now, what I'm seeing with this structure is that it's not quite fully developed. It's a good draft, but it really does need to have a little bit more meat and a little more of that analysis in your posting. Ryan, I enjoy your postings, and thanks for popping on to instant messaging. Remember, you guys can always pop into Blackboard IM. If I'm in there, I'll respond right back. If I happen to be away from my computer, I try to mark it as I'm away, but sometimes it'll show that I'm available. If I don't answer right away, I might be in another meeting, or I might be just away from my computer. But please feel free to use it. Ryan does a lot, and I appreciate that. Now, I believe that your posting is solid. I like that you are engaging not just evidence, but you're thinking about analysis. This idea that there are there are different parts of the poems that demonstrate different subjectivities and positions. I enjoy that you really thought about, reading and rereading and reading it again, which is all that poetry is about. You know, is about this personal relationship that connects to history and beyond. And I like that you did a good job with Marion Moore's. I would have liked to see a bit more evidence, just, maybe some lines from the poetry, but I think you did a good job, and I can see here from Clyde's response, which is a good response. Thanks for doing this, Clyde. I like that you even mentioned the trench warfare, kind of pulling in these outside historical influences on the poetry. And I love that Juan brought in this notion of, you know, that there's not everything has a purpose in the poem, and some things are to be taken. So that there is a sense of playfulness with poetry, but there is also a sense of it's what you get from it and what you put into it. So thanks for that posting. Lorenzo, I think overall your observations were solid. Now, I think that there are some that need a little more evidence, like this you mentioned about being difficult to interpret and that you read it over several times, which is good. But maybe telling us about those difficult lines. What specific lines were arduous? Where did you have the problems and the tensions? That can kind of make your postings a little more engaged. I like this notion of the faces, this notion of tragic, this notion of pessimism, which does pick up on some of the themes of modernism. So I appreciate your observations in that sense, that you are thinking about outside influences and experiences as effect on poetry and on the reader. Scott, thank you so much for your observations. I love that you are involving quotes like this. You mentioned, please let me know beforehand and I'll come out to meet you. And this sense of using the words that you interpreted to support your point of view is key. I believe that you're posting especially about the wasteland, this notion of jumping around, major theme focusing on death, and that honestly you wouldn't want to read it to enjoy it. It's good. You did understand it. It's just you have a different level of understanding, and that is okay. And I believe that that is, in many ways, what Eliot would want you to feel is a sense of disjointedness, alienation, exile, things along those lines. I love that you mentioned in here, and this is Ryan Castle, that a wasteland forced you to read it over and over again. You don't have a grasp, but that you got this sense of chaos and change, and that's good. It is about chaos. It is about change. It is laced with mythical and religious references. I mean, you have Tiresias. You have all of these weird figures that seem to come in and come out of this text, and that's exactly that kind of disjointed, chaotic experience that in many ways reflects the sense of ontological uncertainty that was happening during the modern period. John Fowler picks up on some of these kind of tensions, and that, there is a sense that poetry is difficult. You don't enjoy poetry, it's okay. And I like that you're giving it another chance. I think that you're putting it in your own frame of reference. And you know what? You're not doing a bad job of it either. You really are engaging it. And I like that even though your gut reaction was, ugh, I don't want to read this, you pushed through. And that you talked about, the sense of don't criticize poetry, open it with, use an open mind, which I feel that you are doing. I know that it's difficult. And like I said, I have some strategies that I use for reading poetry that sometimes works. But it is kind of it is a different engaging method. We also have here under this post, and I think all of you had a sense, like Tony mentioned, poetry is frustrating, and that we are rereading it, and that's what poetry is about in many ways. Which it can be enjoyable, and at the same time, it can be distancing. I like that you mentioned that the river merchant's wife was engaging, and that you could talk about kind of what's going on. You could talk about the seasons, and that, maybe connecting the seasons to their relationship, because modern poetry, while it might be about chaos and it might be about kind of tension and alienation. It does love symbols. It does love mythology. It does love the sense of richness that comes from subtextual information. So, Tony, I appreciate your observations of that, of kind of what's going on in the poem mirroring what's going on in the experience. Um, Robert, I think that you mentioned that you like, of course, In a Station on the Metro because of its length, but I think one of your best readings was about poetry. You know, that this tension is to be open-minded, but also that everyone has this gut reaction. I like that Esther kind of popped in and mentioned similar things, as did Sharon. And with a little more evidence, these would be spectacular posts. So remember, always pull in, for instance, T.S. Eliot writes, or for instance, in the poem, Marianne Moore writes, and that will help a lot to make your post strong and clear. Esther mentioned, and I'm sorry, let me pop this open. Esther mentioned in her post also the same kind of disengagement she felt with poetry, but she also mentioned that there was some interest, you know, that there was a sense of young ladies getting married in a station of metro, respecting imagery, but hard to appreciate. I would like to see a little more use of evidence from the poem, or from at least from the classifications, the little overview that comes beforehand, or even you can quote these little podcasts too if you would like. Kristen, I think you did a fantastic job. I love that you are involving the evidence that supports your observations. I love that you mentioned enough about biography and history that it's rich and engaged. And I love that you mentioned that there is a sense of difficulty, that there is a sense of change and shift. I love that you also pulled this monologue in. And like John and Scott and everyone else, I think you've done an excellent job of posting. I enjoy that you don't just take poetry or any of the readings on their surface, that you think about how they engage you and how then you can translate that engagement to your peers. And even though this is an online class and we're not supposed to have the same sense of community in many ways as you might have if we were in a face-to-face environment, I feel that your post and some of your other peers' posts too create a space so that we all can get engaged. We can all talk about this. And we can all think about what these works can contribute to our understanding, how they can give us a sense of what Martha Nussbaum calls the narrative imagination. And that's not about just being able to create fanciful stories. That's about being able to, in many ways, walk a mile in someone else's shoes, see the world from someone else's perspective, to have enough of imagination that you can enter a narrative that someone else has crafted and be in it and be of that moment. Because that gives us a sense of what it means to be someone else. It gives us the empathy and the sympathy. So I love that you, and I see also in Natalie's posting too, you know, that there is more than there's more to the page than what you're talking, there's more to the poem and the page than what's simply there. I love that Natalie mentioned modernistic style. I would have loved to see more about that. Like, how is it modern? How is it referencing this time period? But it's a great start, and it's a good move. Now, specifically, while we were talking, it looks like Michael has posted. So Sharon, nice work. I like that you also are mentioning some of the specific phraseologies and positions. You mentioned past tense. You're reading it, you know, this fourth stanza. You're specifically pulling in evidence. You're giving us some analysis. These are some excellent postings, and I really appreciate them. And of course, lastly, who just posted would be Michael. And Michael, as I was going through, I I love that you mentioned that you thought it was going to be the easiest, and it was the hardest because you had to read so many times. And you know, like I said, that's poetry, and it does take a little bit of time to get through it. I love that you brought in biography and that you kind of put into larger context what was going on. I like that you also used evidence here, and that is key to support your observations of Marianne Moore. So I think overall, everyone did a solid job this week. I think the discussion postings are getting clearer and more focused, that you are using evidence and analysis to kind of put your ideas out there, that you're using the thought of what does it say, what does it mean, what is its value, this kind of Robert Scholes method of reading. Now, what you're going to be doing for this coming week, of course, is you're going to be reading week 5, which is our modern poets, and also our modern short stories. There's a Reading for Style podcast down there for you to observe, and then also you'll want to start preparing for the final, or not for the final, I'm sorry, for the midterm. Now, if you take a look here, you will see that there's a write-up about the Sense of Fitzgerald. There's a write-up about Hemingway because we're reading both of them. And then here I will be posting our study guide, and I will actually be doing that today, which is Sunday. If you do have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to pop into Blackboard IM, pop into Skype, or of course send me an email or pop under Ask Your Instructor. Thanks so much and have a great day.